Everybody. We're going to start. We may have a few more joining in. For some of you, this is a new experience being on Google Meet instead of being on Zoom. Just one second. Some of you, this is new being on Google Meet instead of being on Zoom. Just a couple of notes about this. When you see below you somewhere, you see three dots down on my PC. It's down at the bottom. Where is it on the tablet, on the iPad? The three dots that you use to change.
I have three dots, but what I found is on my iPad, I just tap on the square if I want one of them larger than the other. But
okay, if you go, you see a red phone, looks like a telephone that says "Leave call." That's how you get out of the meeting if you would like. Beside it on mine, there's three dots, and when I hover on it, it says "More options." And if I click on that, one of the options is change layout. And if you change the layout, if you use what is called sidebar, then what will happen is the person who is speaking will be louder. All right? So in that case, for much of that will be Roy. If you like that view, then you click sidebar and then you exit that layout. Also, as you continue along that line, you see a hand, a raised hand. Then you see a CC. The CC turns on closed captioning, and it's really quite accurate. So, especially if you have any trouble at all with the volume, I invite you to click on CC for closed captioning. Besides that, you see a camera. For some of you, that camera right now has a circle and a line through it because your camera is turned off. What that means is your video is not on, so we don't see you, which is just fine if that's what you want. But if you want to be seen, like, for example, to speak and have us see you as you ask a question, then you can turn your camera on by clicking on that camera. And then the very last one is a microphone. When you are not speaking, it's going to be very helpful if you mute yourself. And so when you do that, you will get a circle and a red line through that microphone. Because what otherwise will happen is if you are not muted and somebody else has on that sidebar view, then if you sneeze, for example, and blow your nose, everybody's camera will go to you. You might not want that. The other part of that is that if people are not muted, we tend to get background noises that are just irritating. So when you're just listening, please be muted. If you have a question you would like to speak, one thing you can do is simply click on that microphone, and then you're not muted anymore. Or you can see over somewhere a hand in that line of things you've been looking at. If you click on it, it will say that someone's hand is raised. Right now, I just raised my hand. And then those of us who are, Roy, you don't even need to pay attention to that. I'll be watching over that and direct your attention to somebody who has a hand raised. Okay? Any question? All right. With that in mind, I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Roy Hanson, who with his wife, as a fairly new member. When did you guys join, Roy? Right before?
Right, about a month before the pandemic.
Okay, yeah. So Roy and his wife Barb have been members. They came to us from Dubuque, where Roy was an elementary school principal, and he retired. And they have children and grandchildren in Coralville, so they decided to end up this way, and we were grateful that they ended up Gloria Dei's way. Roy told me he had read this book and he really enjoyed it and wondered if the Green Committee might want to share it. And I suggested that maybe, Roy, he is an educator, maybe you would like to share it. And he was willing to do that. So, Roy, I'm going to turn it over to you, and others of you now, if you would please mute, that would be helpful. I will do the same thing. Roy, welcome.
Thank you. Well, the book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates, as he mentioned, was one of those books that a friend recommended, and I thought, okay, I'll check it out. And I really liked it. I thought it addressed some bigger issues than what Barb and I had always done what we thought was a pretty good job, recycling and doing different things like that. But this had a more of a global picture to it, and I thought it might be helpful to take a look at. And so when we discussed, you mentioned the sidebar that hopefully, the speaker, will most of you be muted most of the time. I really hope you're not muted most of the time and that you're talking, so the discussion is full. And so maybe before we start, if you would post that photo of the PowerPoint slide, Pastor Roger, of the schedule, just to be clear, because it's been a couple of different ways it's been publicized. And so we're starting today. We're going to go through chapter 3. And then in October 3rd, I'm going to be out of town. And Christine is going to be leading a session on a film about carbon, and greenhouse gases. And then on the 10th, we're back for chapters 4 through 9. And then chapter 10. And afterward, his final session. So these dates that are on the screen right now are the accurate dates. So with that, I think we can go ahead and start discussing the book. I guess I like to ask a lot of questions when I lead something. I've never led a book study, so this will be interesting. Anything surprising in the introduction? We'll start kind of section by section and see if anybody had something that came up in that introduction that they thought, oh, this is kind of a surprise, and so I'm just kind of opening that up.
Well, right from the beginning, I discovered that Bill Gates has a gift of taking a whole lot of really complex information and presenting it that I could understand a lot of what he was talking about. So I did enjoy that.
What about those? Yes, I agree. That was one of the things I liked about it as well. Other surprises? What did you think about the 51, the two numbers, right in the very first line of the book? It says there are two numbers you need to know about climate change. The first is 51 billion, the other is 0. Any thoughts on those two numbers?
Lois Lemke has a question.
Yeah, Lois?
An observation. She has her hand raised.
She did a good job.
And
all right.
I knew it too. The thing that impressed me, getting those numbers, because I had no idea of the size, and then he made the importance of going to 0. I thought about decreasing, but not trying to get to 0 before.
I would agree with you on that. That was where my head was at, is how do we decrease? He's going back to 0, and he talks about that more in the first chapter, which is titled Why 0. But I agree. I thought the numbers were helpful, and that was one of the things I thought he did throughout the book, was to bring numbers that were more understandable, maybe, to the conversation. Anyone else on those two numbers? He had another on this page 4 in the book. He talks about he came to focus on climate change in an indirect way through the problem of energy poverty. One of the things he talks about as he goes into this, he says, when it comes to climate change, the poor have the most to lose. The majority of them are farmers who already live on the edge and can't withstand more droughts and floods. What about, do the poor have the most to lose? What do you think? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, well, in fact, we had a bit of a conversation. Back there she is. Christine Schlotfeld had pointed out that there's climate change and there's also climate justice. And it's all well and good if we're going to have electric cars, but who can afford an electric car? or just various other things that, yes, the way it adversely affects people who are already on the edges was a pretty dramatic point.
Christine, did you want to add to that?
Paul Ostrom has his hand
muted.
raised. Paul Ostrom has his hand raised.
Okay. Paul, you want to go ahead there?
I think it's World Hunger has been promoting for many years that climate change really compounds the needs of hungry people throughout the world. And it has to do with this. The people who contribute the least to the climate change disaster are the ones who end up suffering the most. And that has to do certainly also with what Christine says about climate justice as well.
Christine, did you want to? Did you leave or?
I'm here. I'm sort of here. I'm in the fellowship hall, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was trying to also use my laptop, but then I was causing an echo, so I might have to shut down my laptop and just work from the fellowship hall.
I think you need to shut down your laptop, Chris.
Okay, I'll shut that down.
Yeah. But, just while Christine's getting her laptop shut down, one of the things that, we found in Tanzania, when some of us hear from our pen pals over in Same, that, they're on the edge in terms of hunger, and their crops this year, again, have suffered from a drought, and their already bad situation is getting worse with that.
So,
Christine, are you back?
Yeah, I think I'm back. So
okay.
This idea of climate justice is looming larger, I think, because, and we don't see it. We don't see it here in the Midwest, but places like New Orleans are close enough to home, should be close enough to home that we would realize who gets hurt the most when Katrina comes along, or when Ida comes along, or when those hurricanes come. Who gets hurt the worst? It's the people who live in the areas, and they're generally poor, where they're flood prone, and it's going to be the island nations that the very poor island nations that will disappear, and so on in other parts of the world. But even here in the U.S., we're going to see it more and more as storms and things hit areas of our country that are
Carol Solberg has a hand raised.
Right.
I just wanted to say, we've been a little bit smart in the Midwest about, boy, glad we don't live out west, or glad we don't live in hurricane country. And we got hit with derechos, and I think there's been quite a drought this summer in Iowa, and I think we're even getting hit with it. But this is causing such an immigration problem for our country, because as people have no food or whatever, they're being dislocated, or whatever you would say, and having to come here. So it's going to affect us as well.
You bet. And one of the things that somebody mentioned was, and the poor countries are not necessarily using a lot of energy. There's another graph on page 6, and Pastor Roger, it was, I think, the third one there, with the income and energy use go hand in hand. Can you share that for a moment? Yeah, no, the one before that. The one before that one. A couple back. Need you to go back a couple if you can. Well, Anyway, the graph basically showed the energy used per person in 2014 and the income level per person, and that kind of was, I thought, a real helpful graph. I don't know if you can share that. We're not seeing it. It would have been photo 3 on the. That's the one. And I don't know. Those are, if you don't have the book in front of you, basically the energy use per person, is up the left side, and across the bottom is income. And the connection between income and energy use is just incredible. I mean, look at, when you think about poorer countries towards the bottom, and then up at the top, we're the ones that are using all this energy. And because, we're a significant contributor to all this. So anyway, that was something I just wanted to highlight, that chart. Thanks. Any comments when you saw that chart? Any of you that had it, have books, or any other comments about that chart?
As the poorer countries, well, like with China and India, as more and more people are lifted out of poverty, particularly in China, their energy consumption is going through the roof. And that will happen in other countries as well. We're going to, as Bill Gates pointed out, we're going to need to produce even more energy than we do now. So we have to produce more, and yet we have to do it in a clean way. And I don't understand his optimism. I wish I
did. In the first part of the book, I know you read it and you think, oh my gosh, there's no chance. And, and then as you read through and he talks about things that can happen, and I think there's things that possibly that maybe are happening already that we're not aware of. And I'm going to bring that up towards the end. But anyway, it's an issue. And because we are going to be producing more. So how do we cut back to zero? And so I'm going to go back basically to that first chapter 1, that's entitled Why Zero? And that was something Lois mentioned early on. She said she was surprised. She had always, and I agree with her. I'd always been thinking, how do we cut back? How do we cut back? And his contention is going back to zero, which is pretty significant. But, he talks about it in terms of net negative emissions. It means we need to take more greenhouse gases out. And he ended up using the bathtub example. Did anybody, I really like the bath. I need concrete stuff, I guess. But I thought the bathtub example on page 19 was really helpful. Any comments on that?
Yeah, it was a very helpful illustration. I've always had that view also that, if we all just reduce, if we would use like 50% as much energy, boy, that would be really good. Well, the greenhouse gases, unless we learn how to actually harvest them back out of the environment, are there. Like water in a bathtub is there, and you can turn down the faucet to a slower rate, but the bathtub's still going to flood over, right? And so
right.
the crisis, you might delay the crisis a little bit with slowing down, but you're not going to end the crisis until we get to zero.
Right. And also he clarified that he said, in getting to zero, that doesn't actually mean zero. It means near net zero. And so that I thought was really helpful. Again, he did a good job, or his writing team or whoever put this together, I thought did a great job of making it more concrete. Any surprises about methane versus carbon dioxide? That was brought up in this chapter.
We have to stop eating so much meat.
That's one of the methane.
I believe it's.
Go ahead.
I think it's also true that if we feed our cattle grass rather than corn, they produce less methane. So if they munch on pasture grass rather than we fatten them up with corn, they produce less methane. So that's another.
Yeah. Okay. Any other, from this chapter, he talks about Y0, and I thought he had a lot of good points. Did anybody disagree with any of them? Or did anybody say, oh, that's one that really makes his case? I guess I thought he made a lot of cases for it, but were there some you wondered about, or were some examples you thought really effective in getting across his message of Y0?
Well, I don't know about Y0, but by the way, I remind you, if you're not talking, please be muted. Will be helpful. I liked his car illustration. You've seen the greenhouse gases. It's the same as if you have a car, and its windshield allows the sun's energy to get in, but it doesn't allow it to leave. And so it's much warmer in that greenhouse effect area, dangerously warmer. And that he likened that to what the Earth is getting more and more like sitting inside a car, as the atmosphere allows the heat in, but doesn't allow the energy back out. And we needed to do some of that, he said, because without that atmosphere, human life would not exist. I mean, it has to hold some of that heat there, or the planet would be barren.
What about, could you share that, I think it's the next slide, the 3 lines you should know. Let's see. There you go. And that one, for those of you who don't know the book, it says these lines show you how much the temperature might go up in the future if emissions grow a lot. That's the high lines. If they grow less, lower, and if we start removing more carbon than we emit, the negative. And he shows the lines of temperature increase. And he makes the case in the book that temperature differences of 2 degrees Celsius, which is about 3.6 Fahrenheit, if I did that correctly, and you see what happens on the high rates of emissions. I mean, we're going to be over 4 degrees Celsius, and 2 is really kind of the danger point. And so even if we just lower it, we're still going over 2. And, but to get to that negative emission is what takes us below that 2 goal. Any comments on that? Okay, let's go on. One of the things that I thought he did was he gave some great examples of using specific areas of what temperature increases have meant. And one of them was in Puerto Rico, one was in Syria, and he also, getting back to Christine's idea of staying, if you stay close by, or maybe it was Carol's, he talked about Albuquerque on page 26. He said, Albuquerque, in the mid-70s, it was above 90 degrees Fahrenheit about 36 times a year. And by mid-century, the city's thermometers will go up over 90 at least twice as often every year. By the end of this century, the city could see as many as 114 days over 90 degrees. They'll go from 1 month's worth of hot days every year to 3 months' worth. I thought that was pretty staggering. Any other comments about some of these other places like Syria or China or...
I appreciated his analogy that when the ocean warms, it's like pouring gas into a hurricane. It's fuel for hurricanes. And also the reminder that climate and weather are not the same thing.
Right.
People will say, well, look, it just really rained. There's no climate change. What drought are you talking about? But climate is the overall picture. Weather is just a snapshot of what it's doing at a moment. Carol Solberg has her hand raised.
All right, Carol.
I was just going to mention that I thought that was an interesting picture about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and the point that it's going to take 20 years for them to recover from that one hurricane. You know, so that it's a long-term problem for them.
And that comes back to that climate justice issue that Christine raised. You know, with the poor. You know, and back to his comment in the introduction. That climate change, the poor have the most to lose. You know, it takes us a long time to recover from things. I mean, the derecho, the last school building in Cedar Rapids took, till March to finally get fully repaired, where they had every building repaired. And so, they're still, I think, removing trees and dealing with that. So poorer countries are definitely at issue. Looks like our room downstairs has their hand up. Is that you, Christine?
Yes, that's me. You were talking about Maria, the impact of Maria on Puerto Rico, and I think we can look at an example of Haiti that is in the news right now, and they suffered severe storms and hurricanes, and they're still recovering. And now their people have gone to South America, and now they're coming up here, and we've all watched the news and seen the horrible pictures of how that's going. So the climate crisis is driving a lot of this unrest and crises.
So I think going back to Lois's initial statement, about having the zero concept and bringing up the whole concept of zero, I personally thought Bill Gates made his case pretty well in the first chapter of Why Zero. I mean, the chapter was titled Why Zero. I thought he made his case. And if there are no other parts, I'm going to go up, and no other comments on chapter 1, I'm going to move on to chapter 2, and which this will be hard.
Roy, may I make one observation?
Yeah.
This is Roger.
Absolutely.
I liked on the bottom
Yes.
of page 35, the paragraph, I've heard people object to the idea that rich countries should go first. Why should we bear the brunt of this? It's not simply because we've caused most of the problem, although that's true. It's also because this is a huge economic opportunity. The countries that build great zero carbon companies and industries will be the ones that lead the global economy in the coming decades. And I think that's where you need to get our politicians and, we make economic incentives for people to drill oil and dig for coal. We need to make. I think this is where the politics and advocacy comes into play. There's an opportunity here, right?
Absolutely.
And Bill Gates, of course, he knows that they developed whatever they developed at Microsoft, and became the leader of that part of the world. He likens that and has some optimism that same type of thing might happen if resources and intellect are devoted toward this issue.
And there's a website I'll mention now, but I was going to also mention it at the end. It's called sidewalklabs.com. And I encourage you over the next few weeks as you read the book to take some time looking at that. They have podcasts on different things that are happening around the country that they're developing, everything from, anyway, that's further on. But I just those things are kind of happening now in some places. But the policy changes need to happen for these innovations to take place. Okay, chapter 2. A couple things. I thought it starts out very simply. This will be hard, and I thought pages 38 and 39 were really. There was one section there. It's called "A Day in Your Life," or he talked about it as a day in your life. How much do we use fossil fuels? And he talks about everything from the toothbrush to the toothpaste, the grains in your toast and cereal, growing fertilizer, on and on. Any comments on that segment?
Christine
because it goes all the way through.
Okay.
Christine.
Blake had her hand up. Christine Schlafeld.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So I was going to make a comment about the very last part of chapter 1. where he talked about the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the impact that has had worldwide, and comparing that to the potential impact of climate crisis. And that's what these two things are happening right now, and they're what fill me with pessimism. We haven't, as humanity has not reacted well and pulled together to fight COVID, and how Bill Gates thinks we will react well and pull together to fight the climate crisis. Good on him, but I'm pessimistic.
Still pessimistic.
I'm still
All right.
pessimistic.
Well, what I get my hope from that is not that rich countries will do this because it's the right thing to do. Where I'm actually hopeful is that this point will actually be made that there's profit in it for the one who does it right. That is one thing that does motivate people. Anyway.
Right. Yep. And at the end of chapter 3, he starts talking about green premiums concept. And, the whole green premiums concept I thought was another really helpful concept. Right now, I mean, even, in chapter 2, it talks about soft drink cost is cheaper than oil. Oil is cheaper than soft drinks. You had it backwards. Oil is cheaper than a soft drink. And his big case, and I think, Christine, this is the thing that gives me hope, is somehow we need to get to that point, and that Pastor Roger follows up your comment, we need to get to that point where economically it also makes sense, or at least gets close to it. And is anybody else surprised about the cost of oil cheaper than a soft drink? Christine?
Yes, very much so. And then you were talking about pages 38 and 39, where he really illustrates how oil and fossil fuels are all around, ubiquitous. They're all around us and in everything that we use and eat, and how we live, just our daily lives. Everything is touched by fossil fuels. I think he does a magnificent job of showing, of tying everything together and giving us really good examples that we can understand. And this idea of the cost of fossil fuel and oil being less than soda is just a super, super really clear example. He's very good at giving those examples that really explain it.
Yep. And on page 40, he talks about, he said, you think about the scope of this problem can be dizzying, but it doesn't need to be paralyzing. And I guess those are the pieces that, give some hope. There was another comment on, let's see. Oh, I thought there was a comment on page 42 where he said, as we expand our populations and expand our cities, the world will be building the equivalent of another New York City every month for the next 40 years. So as we start, as countries that are currently in poverty start coming out, if we get them to come out of poverty, which we need to do, they're going to be consuming more energy, and I thought that was really helpful. The other thing I thought, which I don't believe I had a photo for, was, or a slide, was on page 44, and it talks about how long it takes to make transition to different energy sources. And we don't have the time to take as long. It took coal, 60 years to increase in its use, and we just don't have that time to really make some transition. So public policy makes a point on page 45, is because we have to force an unnaturally speedy transition and introduce a level of complexity in public policy and technology. And, it uses the Moore's Law example. That's where I saw it in this book. We were just talking about Moore's Law after sun last Sunday night. And, you know, microprocessors would double in power every 2 years. And he talks about, compared with the car, you know, think about the mileage on page 46 is the first Model T in 1908 got no better than 21 miles to the gallon. And as I write this, the top hybrid on the market gets 58 miles to the gallon. In more than a century, fuel economy has improved by less than a factor of 3. And, you know, that's interesting. Page 47, he talked about, I'm just going to highlight a couple things. Boy, we're running out of time here. Society tolerates very little risk. We demand reliable electricity. He's going to be talking about that in the future as well. So not only are we don't want electricity, we don't want a source, a renewable source that ends up not working well either. I mean, whatever we develop has to be effective. And I thought the last section of that paragraph was interesting. It said, since the accidents at 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, America has broken ground on just 2 nuclear plants, even though more people die from coal pollution in a single year than have died in all the nuclear accidents combined. And, you know, I always had this image of, oh boy, nuclear power plants are dangerous. But in the perspective of that, I don't know, do you agree with that? Did anybody else see that and wonder about that? Or Carol?
I was going to say, my son and I have this conversation all the time, and he's like, he really pushes nuclear plants and their safety. And I talk about, well, how long it takes to get rid of the byproducts there and what they're doing, you know. And I said, until we can really figure out how to get rid of the byproducts. But he claims that we will never be energy free of the bad energy until we, at least during the transition period, take on the this dangerous, I think,
The nuclear.
the nuclear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think Bill Gates would probably make that case as well. And you know, like I said, I've always been I grew up a little bit north of a nuclear power plant in Illinois, and you know, the water always seemed warmer down by that plant. I always wondered about it, but on Lake Michigan. But anyway, and again, he finishes chapter 2 on 48 and 49 talking about policies, everything from tax rules to environmental regulations have a huge impact on how people and companies behave. You know, one of the clearest things that we've ever seen, Barb and I were in Norway, and Norway decided they really wanted people to drive electric cars. And so the taxes on a gas-powered car over there have traditionally been exceedingly high. A $50,000 car would probably cost you $85,000 by the time you pay taxes. Well, they said, you buy an electric car, there's no tax on it. And you don't have to pay for parking when you're in cities. And they did all these incentives, and I think we were there a few years ago, and I think at that time they were up to about 45%, 50% electric vehicle. But the point is, it takes a long time to make that transition. But it obviously, having that public policy made a huge difference. I guess I just want to highlight a couple things in chapter 3. He talks about, he has 5 questions to ask in every climate conversation. And if you have a chance to spend some more time on that question, those questions, I just thought when you read that, those of you who read it, which question do you think was the toughest, and what's the biggest surprise? Any quick comments on that before we wrap up here in a few minutes?
I had no idea that cement used fossil fuel in its production. It was
Thank you, me too. And there was there was one more slide. Can you toss that up, please, Pastor Roger? how much greenhouse gas is emitted by the things we do. It's on page 55. Next one, I think it's the last one. Yeah, one more. Yes, you know, making things. Cement, steel, and plastic, 31% of our greenhouse gases. And you think, well, how do we build buildings? We're going to be building New York City and, you know, other cities like New York City. This Sidewalk Labs website is really interesting. Our son was talking to us about it, and it takes a look at what are some of those alternatives. And there are some alternatives out there that people are creating, and how do we get it? It's not, and Bill Gates makes I'm going to make this comment real quick before we end. One of the comments he makes is, you know, public policy, if we get things down to that green premium, where if the green premiums are negligible and it doesn't cost that much to make these transitions, why aren't we doing it? It's public policy that prevents that. And if you look at the Sidewalk Labs website at some point, it talks about building out of pressed timber and different things. And I found it very, very fascinating. I listened to a couple of podcasts on that site. And anyway, it shows that there are things out there. So pay attention to the green premiums concept. That comes up in a future chapter. In the next 5 chapters, 4 through 9, have a lot of great things about the green premiums.
So the way, to clarify, if I understand the green premium, that is, you want the green premium is how much will it cost to do this green? And in other words, you want it lower, so that right now, for example, I really would like to drive an electric car. I'm just not quite at the point where I believe I can afford one, and so it's got a high green premium. He's optimistic that if, as industry gets on, and you see more electric cars coming out all the time, they're going to get more and more affordable. I'm willing to pay a green premium. I don't feel like I'm able to pay some of the green premiums when it's so much higher. And that's where he says it is in those places where the green premium is high. That's where we need our resources being devoted, and our best scientists, our best investors, to be lowering those green premiums so that we can do things in a way that's more affordable or doable.
Right, and that green premiums concept is going to play a big part of our next discussion. And to talk about that whole, what is the green premium? An example, and when Barb got her first hybrid car, and she, it was a Camry, and we decided we wanted to check to see what can we afford the difference in cost, because at that time it was more money than a regular Camry was. And we found out as we did some research, Toyota had started working on, or Consumer Reports or somebody had done something and said, it's going to take, and if you buy a hybrid Camry, in 2.5 years, you'll make up the difference in cost of that initial purchase. A Highlander would take about 7 years at that time to make up the difference in cost. And so that they were talking about green premiums without talking about the word green premiums. But it's that whole concept of how do we make it affordable? And when you think about that, with all electric cars, I think it'd be interesting to find out. It is more expensive. I wonder how much money you save over time, or how much electricity costs. We've got about a minute. We've got actually no time, but Christine's got her hand up.
Roy, I'm going to leave the meeting. I'm going to leave the meeting, but you should still be able to be on.
Okay.
All right.
I was just going to say that the idea of the green premium, I was having trouble really getting it to stick in my head until I thought of the example of organic. So in some cases, I'm willing to pay that extra cost to get organic, and other times I'm not. And that's that premium price of organics is just like the green premium for the things that Bill's talking about, energy saving and
right.
So on.
That's a good example, and I think what his point is, we need to get to the point where the green premium is negligible enough that it's no longer a decision of can we afford to do it. It's more of a decision of, we need to be able to do it because now we can afford it. Carol?
Yeah, I just ran across a quote by Wendell Berry this week, and I don't know who he is, but this really hit me with the book. He said, "We have lived our lives by the assumption that what was good for us would be good for the world. We have been wrong. We must change our lives so that it will be possible to live by the contrary assumption that what is good for the world will be good for us. And that requires that we make the effort to know the world and learn what is good for it." I thought that really went along well with this book.
Yes, that's that, and thanks for sharing. We'll tackle chapter 9. Get some more specific stuff. Talk about the things we plug in and stuff, and then a week more maybe about and the issues. The other thing, I'm going to give you no, just kidding. One of the things that I is you always hear about all disasters. I mean, we don't need more examples of what's happening. You know that it's a deal. One thing that has surprised me since I read this is I have seen a number of things in the mail that came through that talked about things going on. Financial companies was talking about the kinds of investments they're making now that are more green investments, and so they're not investing anymore in or in fossil fuel type companies. And so I'm starting to see that stuff, and look for that. I guess if you have a chance over this next book time, like you found the quote, Carol, but also look to see if you run into some of these positive things that are happening, and bring that back by that last discussion, so we can share out some of those things that are occurring, that are positive approaches to the climate change problem. So anyway, hope you enjoy the next part of the book. I look forward to visiting in a couple of weeks on that, and thanks for participating. We'll see you all later.